Have you ever wondered why attempts to change your life so often end with a return to old, destructive habits? At first, full of enthusiasm, people suddenly find themselves back where they started, as if an unknown force is pulling them back. And what's most unpleasant, this scenario repeats itself again and again, creating the impression of an endless cycle of self-sabotage. However, few realize that the root of this problem lies not in a lack of discipline or willpower, but in the deep, hidden corners of the mind. Carl Jung warned that true change is impossible without understanding these internal processes. But do not despair, there is a way out. There are ways to recognize and take control of this invisible force that undermines self-discipline, productivity, and even relationships with others. Have you ever felt that, despite all your efforts, something is holding you back, preventing you from moving forward? As if some dark force is secretly hindering your development. For many, this is not just an annoying obstacle, but a serious blow to self-esteem. Striving for change and making every effort, they face internal resistance, the nature of which they cannot understand. Self-sabotage unfolds according to a scenario marked by frightening predictability. The starting point is a feeling of dissatisfaction, whether it is dissatisfaction with physical fitness, level of productivity, quality of relationships, or any other aspect of existence. This internal dissatisfaction becomes a catalyst for the desire for change, which is often accompanied by a powerful surge of motivation. At this moment, a person feels that the time has come to act, develops detailed plans, sets ambitious goals, and commits to forming new, healthy habits. The first days or even weeks instill optimism. A sense of control over the situation strengthens confidence in one's own abilities, and it seems that everything is moving in the right direction. However, then there is a turning point. The new routine begins to depress. The efforts that previously brought satisfaction turn into a heavy burden. Minor failures occur, a missed workout at the gym, postponing important tasks, returning to bad habits that seem to be in the past. The mind invents excuses. It was an exhausting day. It's just this once. But this just this once is repeated again and again, and a person imperceptibly finds himself in the same place from which he began his journey. The problem is not only in returning to old habits, but also in the negative emotional consequences of this regression. Each failure generates disappointment, which in turn leads to guilt, and guilt, in the end, leads to despondency and apathy. A feeling of helplessness develops, which fuels the belief that positive changes in life are simply impossible. The author of these lines knows firsthand the exhausting cycle of fruitless attempts at self-improvement. For many years, he, like many, was a prisoner of an endless series of beginnings that never led to the desired result. He was always distinguished by ambitious aspirations. He dreamed of greater self-discipline, stunning productivity, and crystal clarity. He longed to create something truly significant that could radically transform his existence. However, no matter how hard he tried, some unknown force repeatedly pulled him to the bottom. The scenario was repeated with enviable consistency. Dissatisfaction with himself reached its apogee. A glance in the mirror gave rise to a firm decision. Enough. From this day on, everything will be different. And at first it seemed that change was destined to come true. Early rising, detailed planning of the day, conscious avoidance of distracting factors, and strict adherence to the plan instilled confidence. For several weeks, the author felt that he had finally taken the reins of his life into his own hands. But then, like a bolt from the blue, a failure occurred. One day he allowed himself to go to bed later than usual. The next day he postponed an important task. Social networks, from which he had tried so hard to escape, began to absorb precious hours again. A workout that seemed vital was postponed indefinitely. He tried to convince himself that this was just a temporary respite, a short pause in the progressive movement forward. But deep down he knew the bitter truth. He was inexorably returning to his old, ingrained habits. When the bitter realization of re-entering the vicious circle came, a feeling of deep disappointment overwhelmed his soul. A painful question arose in his head. Why am I like this? Why, possessing knowledge about what is necessary, am I unable to curb my will and stick to the intended path? The most depressing thing was the feeling of helplessness. Observing the successes of others, people seemingly endowed with unwavering willpower, capable of taking on commitments and steadfastly fulfilling them, a person would bitterly recognize their own powerlessness, repeating the same mistakes. Over time, faith in their own ability to change would begin to melt away like smoke. The thought crept in that perhaps they were simply devoid of innate discipline, that they lacked the inner core necessary for a radical life change. It was at this moment that the decision was made to turn to the deep and wise teachings of Carl Jung. If willpower alone failed to achieve the desired changes, it could only mean one thing. A hidden force lurked within, an invisible but powerful mechanism sabotaging all efforts. Studying Jung's works, the person discovered that within each of us exists a hidden realm of the mind, a repository of impulses, beliefs, and suppressed emotions operating outside the realm of our conscious control. And then everything fell into place. The problem was never a lack of motivation or discipline. The real obstacle was always the person themselves, their unconscious schemes and patterns that governed their actions, remaining unnoticed. The human mind, like a stubborn beast, resists innovation, even if it promises good. The brain, this complex mechanism, tends to hold old habits captive as the familiar seems like a safe haven. However, this inertia is not a personal fault, but rather an automatic psychological process designed to protect from the unknown. And then comes the realization. To achieve change, it is not enough to have only ardent desire or titanic efforts. It is necessary to unravel the mystery of self-sabotage, to identify those hidden forces that hinder progress. This moment becomes a turning point when the person stops blaming themselves for a lack of discipline and begins to explore the invisible mechanisms that hinder their progress. And here a surprising truth is revealed. What previously seemed like weaknesses, laziness, procrastination, lack of motivation, turns out to be just symptoms of something deeper. And this something has a name. Carl Jung, an outstanding psychologist, called it the shadow, the hidden side of the personality, where fears, doubts, and beliefs that hinder development are hidden. Immersion in this concept becomes the starting point for transformation. Self-sabotage is not an accident, but a phenomenon subject to its own logic, with a reason for existence. But before revealing the mechanism of its action, it is important to learn the main thing. Overcoming self-sabotage does not mean getting rid of internal resistance. The key is not in eliminating resistance, but in knowing how to manage it. And when a person understands how their shadow works, they realize that they have much more power over their life than they previously thought. Throughout the life path of each person, their shadow is formed, a complex and multifaceted aspect of personality. From an early age, under the influence of upbringing and the social environment, the individual assimilates norms of behavior that define the boundaries of what is permissible and unacceptable. A child who expresses anger or disappointment may face condemnation from parents, and spontaneous behavior in a formal setting may result in punishment. As a result of such situations, the child gradually forms a belief about the unacceptability of certain traits of their character. However, these rejected aspects of personality do not disappear without a trace, but go into the shadow of the unconscious. It is important to understand that the shadow is not just an accumulation of negative qualities. On the contrary, it can contain powerful but suppressed forces capable of enriching a person's life. Unfortunately, having learned to hide these qualities, a person deprives themselves of the opportunity to use their potential. As a result, the shadow begins to manifest itself in roundabout ways, one of which is self-sabotage. Every time an individual strives for change, development, or to go beyond the usual patterns, they come into conflict with their shadow. It is in it that deep-seated fears, insecurities, and beliefs encoded throughout life are stored. For example, if a person grew up in an environment where they were constantly instilled with the idea of their inadequacy, the shadow will stubbornly reproduce this belief, even if they possess all the necessary skills to achieve success. Similarly, if ambitions were considered something reprehensible, the unconscious part of the personality may block any attempts at self-realization and career development. The mechanism of this process often goes unnoticed. At first, the changes seem simple and achievable. The person experiences a surge of enthusiasm, they are overflowing with energy, and they firmly believe in the success of the upcoming changes. However, gradually exhaustion sets in, interest disappears, and apathy appears. Attention is scattered on trifles, time seems to slip through fingers. The inner voice begins to invent reasons to postpone actions or abandon them altogether. What seemed like a solid plan for transformation subtly morphs into a set of excuses. The shadow doesn't act directly but insidiously, influencing thoughts and feelings before a person even realizes its influence. People may wonder for years why they can't establish a beneficial habit, unaware of a deeply hidden, unconscious force resisting it. This resistance manifests in various forms. Sometimes it appears as procrastination, an overwhelming urge to postpone important tasks for no apparent reason. In other cases, it's expressed as excessive self-criticism, an internal voice that constantly says, "Don't even bother trying." It can also manifest in repetitive scenarios, such as entering destructive relationships or abandoning projects halfway through. The mind, full of good intentions and aspirations, yearns to move forward, yet a dark force called the shadow relentlessly pulls it back. This phenomenon is explained by the fact that the shadow represents the comfort zone, the familiar and known. Even in situations where an individual experiences deep dissatisfaction with their existence, repeating established patterns of behavior seems safer and more predictable than uncharted horizons. For the unconscious, any transformation involves risk, and when a threat arises, the shadow activates to protect the person from potential danger, even if this protection manifests in preventing personal growth and development. The paradox is that the more a person ignores their shadow, the more power it gains. It's like a hidden program, subtly running in the background of the mind, insidiously influencing decisions, erecting invisible obstacles, and ultimately shaping a person's destiny before they realize what's happening. Self-sabotage is not merely a manifestation of a lack of discipline or willpower. Rather, it reflects a deep internal conflict between the conscious desire for change and unconscious forces that desperately want to maintain the status quo. The solution to this problem is not a direct confrontation with the shadow, for everything we confront in the unconscious only gains additional power. The true path to liberation lies in recognizing this hidden part of one's personality and bringing it into the light of consciousness. Only when we dare to look our shadow directly in the eye can we stop allowing it to sabotage our life choices and aspirations. When a shadowy force subtly influences our decisions before we realize it, the first step to liberation is recognizing it. However, this task is by no means trivial, as it concerns the part of the psyche that has been pushed into the realm of the unconscious. It doesn't manifest directly, but rather disguises itself in repetitive patterns of behavior that seem devoid of all logic. For example, a person sincerely strives for a healthy lifestyle, but constantly finds excuses to avoid physical exercise. They dream of high productivity, but every time they try to start an important project, they feel as if they're being held back by an invisible barrier. They claim to yearn for harmonious relationships, but invariably choose partners who repeatedly recreate old traumas. All this is not mere coincidence. The unconscious builds complex defense mechanisms to protect the conscious mind from confronting the shadow side. The problem is that such protection comes at too high a cost. The person finds themselves trapped in vicious cycles that steadily sabotage their personal growth and development. According to Carl Jung, becoming aware of the shadow requires careful self-observation. This involves being able to notice those moments when the same problems arise again and again and asking oneself honest questions about their root cause. However, Jung was not the only one who explored this complex topic. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, considered one of the forerunners of existentialism, spoke of a similar phenomenon, which he called unconscious despair. He believed that many people live in a state of self-deception, running from the truth about themselves because confronting it would be too painful. Kierkegaard argued that true freedom is attained only when a person realizes what is holding them back. This is the essence of it. Recognizing the shadow requires considerable courage. It's not easy to admit that destructive patterns of behavior arise not simply from laziness or a lack of motivation, but have much deeper roots. To see one's shadow means facing fears, disappointments, and beliefs that have been suppressed for years. This is not limited to reflecting on the past, but also to carefully observing how certain patterns continue to be reproduced in the present. One of the paths to self-knowledge is paying close attention to flashes of strong emotions. When a situation or statement elicits a disproportionately strong negative reaction, it may signal that something deeply hidden and suppressed is trying to break through to the surface of consciousness. Another way to discover the shadow aspects of personality is to observe one's own projections. Excessive criticism of others often indicates that we are irritated by the reflection of qualities in another person that we ourselves diligently suppress. For example, if the sight of a confident person causes acute aversion, it may indicate that deep down the individual has learned that expressing confidence is unacceptable. Envy of those who boldly take risks may be associated with a subconscious fear of active actions and changes. The shadow rarely manifests openly, but it always leaves noticeable traces. Recognizing these traces is not a reason for self-flagellation, but an important step towards liberation from internal limitations. Imagine a long, dark corridor with doors stretching along it. Behind each of them lie parts of your personality that have been blocked throughout your life. Behind one door may lie suppressed anger, behind another, unrealized talents, and behind a third, fears that you have tried to forget. You have always known about the existence of these doors, but avoided opening them. The problem is that despite your ignoring them, these locked aspects continue to influence your life. The shadow does not disappear because it is not noticed. On the contrary, left in the dark, it begins to act independently, uncontrollably, and unconsciously, distorting your perception and behavior. Instead of confronting the hidden aspects of personality, Jung called for their exploration and acceptance. The integration of the shadow, in his opinion, represents the process of achieving integrity, of reuniting with those parts of oneself that were previously rejected or suppressed. But how to carry out this process? The first step on the path to knowing your shadow inevitably becomes a feeling of discomfort. This experience can be compared to turning on the light in an abandoned basement where unnecessary things have accumulated for years. At first, a cloud of dust rises and the prevailing chaos seems insurmountable. However, over time, vision adapts, and it becomes possible to see all the details. Jung called this process awareness of the unconscious, emphasizing that it is not only about recognizing the existence of the shadow, but also about developing the ability to interact with it. One of the most effective methods in this context is reflective writing. Instead of avoiding unpleasant thoughts, you should write them down, conducting a kind of dialogue with your own mind. It is important to ask yourself questions. What am I trying to avoid? Why does this cause such a strong reaction in me? What does this part of me want to tell me? Such an internal dialogue can shed light on the deep-seated fears and blocks that underlie self-sabotage and hinder personal growth. However, there is another facet of the shadow that escapes the attention of most. It includes not only our deepest fears, but also our innermost desires that we carefully hide. Often, what causes our admiration in others, their qualities and achievements that seem unattainable, actually lies dormant in our shadow, waiting for the moment when we allow it to manifest. For example, a person consumed by envy of someone else's self-confidence may well be suppressing their own desire for free self-expression. Friedrich Nietzsche, a German philosopher, deeply explored this topic, speaking of the free spirit. a personality that allows itself to be authentic and whole without fear of condemnation from others. In his opinion, the greatest tragedy of human existence is that many spend their lives trying to conform to social norms, while their true self remains buried inside. Integration of the shadow is not just a path to healing, but also to liberation. By recognizing and accepting the rejected aspects of one's personality, a person regains a part of themselves endowed with enormous potential. Suppressed rage can transform into determination, fear into prudence, and hidden desire into purposeful action. Ultimately, daring to open the door to the depths of one's own mind is an act of the greatest courage. It is impossible to achieve genuine development by avoiding confrontation with what has been discarded. But when this happens, something powerful is born: the ability to live without fear of oneself, accepting that all one's facets, both light and dark. Awareness of one's own shadow is an important step on the path to self-knowledge, but genuine changes begin only when this awareness is embodied in concrete actions. Carl Jung rightly argued that enlightenment is achieved not through contemplation of bright images, but through a deep understanding of one's own darkness. In other words, simply identifying unconscious behavior patterns is not enough. It is necessary to actively resist them so that they no longer have a destructive impact on life. One effective method that facilitates this process is gradual exposure. The unconscious resists change because it perceives the unknown as a potential threat. Often people strive for instant changes, forcibly introducing new behavior patterns, which only intensifies resistance. A much more productive approach is to gradually introduce small doses of transformation. For example, if a person is constrained by a fear of failure, the primary task is not to strive for perfection, but to deliberately immerse oneself in situations fraught with minor setbacks while avoiding self-flagellation. If procrastination dominates, the goal is not to complete all tasks at once, but to start with a minimum amount of time, for example, 5 minutes of active work. The unconscious needs time to adapt to changes and fully accept them. Our mental state directly depends on how we organize our daily habits. Self-destructive behavior often manifests as automatic patterns that we unconsciously repeat. This is where the concept of habit change comes into play, as detailed in James Clear's book Atomic Habits. The author emphasizes that a common mistake when trying to form a new routine is that people focus solely on the positive habit without eliminating the triggers of the old ones. For example, if someone wants to spend less time on social media, simply deciding, "I will use my phone less," is not enough. It is much more effective to create an environment in which distractions are less accessible, such as deleting apps from the phone or leaving the device in another room. Carl Jung also noted that the unconscious acts symbolically. By changing the external environment, we send a signal of change to our inner world. Another important method is behavioral activation, a psychological principle based on the fact that action precedes motivation. Many wait until they feel ready before taking action, but in reality the mind adapts to a new identity only when the body begins to behave accordingly. Jung argued that the unconscious manifests through direct experience, not just through rational thinking. Instead of waiting for a surge of energy and motivation to change, it is worth simply taking the first step, even the smallest one. If you need to start a project, you can open a document and write anything. If you want to exercise, just put on a tracksuit and go for a walk. These small but regular actions gradually shape the unconscious, helping it to accept the new identity that the person is building. Applying the acting opposite technique can be a powerful tool in combating self-sabotage. Often, when we fall into the trap of self-destructive tendencies, our actions become automatic. We avoid difficult tasks, postpone important matters, or allow fear to paralyze us. However, if instead of blindly following these destructive impulses, we consciously choose the opposite path, we destroy ingrained unconscious behavior patterns. For example, when a thought arises that undermines our productivity, whispering, "I'll do it later," it is necessary to act decisively immediately. Or, if the inner shadow makes us avoid communicating with a certain person due to feelings of insecurity, we should take the initiative and start a conversation. Carl Jung viewed this process as a necessary confrontation with one's own internal archetypes in order to free oneself from their despotic control over our psyche. Meditation and mindfulness also play an important role in integrating shadow aspects of personality. The unconscious manifests as automatic thoughts, sudden impulses, and suppressed emotions. Simply observing these manifestations without engaging in reaction can significantly reduce their power over us. Jung saw meditation as a way to establish a direct channel of communication with the unconscious, allowing it to express itself freely without resistance. By practicing mindfulness, a person develops the ability to recognize moments when their shadow is trying to influence their decisions and gains the opportunity not to succumb to its destructive impulses. As another effective self-improvement technique, one can suggest compiling a list of unrealized tasks. C.G. Jung argued that the path of individuation, that is, the achievement of integrity by a person, involves uniting various aspects of the psyche that have become disjointed during the course of life. In a more grounded sense, this fragmentation manifests as small promises made to oneself that are never kept. Any unfulfilled task, any abandoned project, is essentially a small breach in self-awareness. Creating a list of such unfulfilled obligations and systematically fulfilling them can be a powerful symbolic act of restoring mental integrity. While all these methods are quite applicable individually, it's essential to consider the boundlessness and complexity of the unconscious. Jung dedicated himself to exploring the human psyche and realized that some behavioral patterns are not easy to work through alone. Seeking help from a qualified professional, whether a psychotherapist, psychoanalyst, or psychologist, can significantly accelerate this process and help uncover layers of the shadow that might go unnoticed in independent work. The process of self-discovery is a deep and endless journey, and the support of an experienced guide can be crucial. Shadow integration is not just a specific set of actions, it's a continuous process of personal growth. Triumphing over inner sabotage opens the gates to true freedom. By mastering the art of recognizing one's own barriers and applying effective strategies to overcome them, one frees oneself from the shackles of the unconscious, becoming the architect of one's own destiny. Personal transformation is not a fleeting event but a gradual movement on an ascending spiral. It's a common belief that a spark of sudden revelation is enough for radical change, as if one act of willpower is sufficient to reshape established habits, deeply ingrained beliefs, and automatic behavioral reactions. However, the truth is that genuine transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's forged gradually, day by day, in the relentless practice of self-awareness and self-improvement. Integrating the shadow side is not a final point, but a starting point. When the veil is lifted on what was previously hidden in the depths of the subconscious, a new question arises: how to use the acquired knowledge. It's not enough to simply identify destructive patterns, recognize past mistakes, or understand the nature of inner blocks. The key question is how to transform this awareness into concrete actions aimed at creating a new reality. One of the key elements of the answer is inner harmony. Many fail on the path of change because of a deep conflict between their idealized self-image and their actual way of life. Striving for discipline, they continue to identify with a person prone to procrastination. They crave success but subconsciously perceive it as something negative and destructive. The mind resists change if self-identification is still strongly linked to the past. Therefore, the starting point on the path to sustainable change is restoring self-awareness from within. Instead of fruitless attempts to impose foreign habits on oneself, it's crucial to recognize oneself as a person who already possesses the desired qualities. A person striving for greater productivity must abandon the thought, "I am lazy and I need to change," and begin to act as if they are already the purposeful and organized individual they dream of becoming. This principle finds support among many modern thinkers and psychologists, but its roots go back centuries. Aristotle argued that our repeated actions shape our essence. For him, perfection was not a talent bestowed from above, but the result of daily work on oneself, a habit honed over time. In other words, Self-identification is not something frozen and immutable. It is formed under the influence of repeated actions. Genuine changes occur in small things, in the moments when a person decides to act in a new way, even if their mind tries to return them to their former, habitual patterns of behavior. Each such choice strengthens the new version of oneself. Each small victory, even if it seems insignificant, contributes to the formation of the person one is becoming. However, it's important to remember that true transformation requires patience and perseverance. Many people fail because they expect instant and radical changes, not realizing that this process is gradual. Integrating shadow aspects of personality, changing established patterns of behavior, and building a new identity all take time and effort. There is a widespread misconception that failure in the process of personal transformation inevitably returns a person to the starting point. However, it should be recognized that failures are an integral part of any progress. Any changes occur in waves, with periods of ups and downs, moments of uncertainty, and temporary setbacks. The key difference between those who are truly capable of change and those who remain stagnant lies not in the absence of mistakes, but in the ability to move forward despite them. Ultimately, a deep understanding of oneself is not merely a subject of philosophical contemplation, but a vital necessity for those who aspire to an authentic life, free from self-destructive actions. True transformation occurs not when a person gets rid of their flaws, but when they learn to accept them, use them for good, and grow through them. Self-sabotage is a vicious cycle that keeps many people trapped in destructive patterns of behavior, often without even realizing it. A person spends a lifetime trying to change through willpower, but the root of the problem lies within themselves, in the unconscious aspects of their personality that influence their actions. As Carl Jung stated, what a person is unaware of within themselves will still control them. Only when they become aware of their inner contradictions and come face to face with their shadow can they regain control of their own life.